Hey guys, tonight, we're exploring the nature of the perfect crime and the phantoms who haunt our history by getting away with it. We'll begin with the story of a man who doesn't even have a real name. He is known to the world only by the alias he gave on a plane ticket. He was a quiet, middle-aged man in a business suit who, on the night before Thanksgiving in 1971, committed one of the most audacious and elegant crimes in American history. He hijacked a Boeing 727, extorted a massive ransom, and then, with a calm professionalism that baffled the FBI, he strapped on a parachute and leaped from the back of the plane into a freezing, storm-tossed night over the rugged Pacific Northwest. He simply stepped out of the world and into folklore. His name, or the name he used, was Dan Cooper. Before you get comfortable, maybe take a moment to imagine the feeling of flying at night. The sense of being suspended in a small, lighted room high above a world of pure, silent darkness. Think about the courage or the madness it would take for a person to willingly leap into that void, a ghost disappearing into the storm. It's a comfort to know we can explore these dark chapters together. A quiet community gathering from all corners of the globe. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. And on that note, if you truly appreciate what we do here, the quiet, respectful space we try to create for these stories, a like and a subscribe is the very best way to show it. It helps us continue this journey together. Now, dim the lights. Let's take a leap of faith into the storm-tossed night of November 24th, 1971, and the story of the man who fell from the sky and vanished forever. The D.B. Cooper skyjacking the afternoon of Wednesday, November 24th, 1971, was a typical pre-holiday affair at Portland International Airport in Oregon. The air was gray and drizzly, the mood one of hurried anticipation as travelers prepared to fly home for Thanksgiving. At the ticket counter for Northwest Orient Airlines, a man approached. He was unremarkable in every way, a specter of middle-aged anonymity. He was in his mid-40s, between 5 feet 10 inches and 6 feet tall, dressed in a dark business suit, a crisp white-collared shirt, and a narrow black necktie, held in place with a mother-of-pearl tie clip. He carried a black attaché case and identified himself as Dan Cooper. He purchased a one-way ticket for the short, 30-minute flight to Seattle on Flight 305. He paid in cash. Nothing about him raised any suspicion. He was just another businessman on another routine flight. He boarded the Boeing 727-100 and took his seat, 18C, in the rear of the aircraft. He was quiet and polite. He ordered a bourbon and soda and smoked a Raleigh cigarette while he waited for the plane to take off. The flight was only about a third full, with 36 passengers and 6 crew members. At 2:50 p.m., Flight 305 took off from Portland, climbing into the gray, overcast sky. It was a short flight, and everything was proceeding with perfect, mundane normalcy. A few minutes after takeoff, as the plane ascended over the rugged landscape of the Pacific Northwest, Dan Cooper initiated his plan with a calm, almost unnerving, subtlety. He caught the attention of a 23-year-old flight attendant named Florence Schaffner, who was seated in a jump seat near him at the rear of the plane. He handed her a folded piece of paper. Florence, assuming it was a lonely businessman's phone number, slipped the note, unread, into her purse. Cooper leaned closer. "Miss," he said quietly, "you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Florence retrieved the note from her purse. The words, written in neat, all-capital letters with a felt-tip pen, were simple and terrifying. The note stated that he had a bomb in his briefcase and that he wanted her to sit beside him. Florence did as she was told, taking the empty seat next to Cooper. He calmly opened his attaché case just enough for her to see what was inside. She saw a mass of wires, 2 red cylinders that looked like sticks of dynamite, and a large battery. Whether the bomb was real or an elaborate fake has never been determined, but to Florence Schaffner in that moment, it was terrifyingly real. Cooper then closed the briefcase and, in a low, even voice, stated his demands. He wanted $200,000 in negotiable American currency. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 primary back chutes, and 2 reserve chest chutes. And he wanted a fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the plane upon their arrival. He instructed Florence to take these demands to the captain in the cockpit. He was calm, articulate, and specific. This was not a man who was panicking or making things up as he went along. This was a man with a clear, well-thought-out plan. Florence walked the long aisle to the cockpit and relayed the information to the captain, William Scott. Captain Scott immediately contacted Seattle-Tacoma Airport Air Traffic Control, who in turn notified the local police and the FBI. The hijacking was now officially underway. The airline's president, Donald Nyrop, made the decision to cooperate fully with the hijackers' demands. The lives of the passengers and crew were the primary concern. The money was just money. The frantic process of assembling the ransom began on the ground. The FBI scrambled to gather the $200,000, ensuring it was all in unmarked $20 bills, as Cooper had not specified otherwise. They photographed all 10,000 bills, a painstaking process that would, they hoped, allow them to track the money if it ever re-entered circulation. While the preparations were being made on the ground, Captain Scott instructed the crew to maintain an atmosphere of normalcy on the plane. Most of the passengers were completely unaware that they were in the middle of a hijacking. They were told that their arrival in Seattle would be delayed due to a minor mechanical issue requiring a holding pattern. For nearly 2 hours, the Boeing 727 circled Puget Sound, buying time for the FBI and the airline to meet Cooper's demands. On board, Dan Cooper remained a picture of eerie composure. He ordered another bourbon and soda and calmly paid for it. He even offered to request meals for the flight crew while they were waiting. He was polite, considerate, and never lost his temper. The flight attendants who interacted with him would later describe him as a gentleman. He was not the violent, unstable hijacker they might have expected. His calm demeanor was, in its own way, more unsettling than any overt threat. It spoke of a man who was completely in control of the situation, a man who had thought through every contingency and was confident in the outcome of his plan. He seemed to know more about the aircraft than they did, at one point commenting on the specific geography they were flying over and noting that Tacoma was nearby. At 5:24 p.m., the ground crew in Seattle signaled that the ransom money and parachutes were ready. Just 15 minutes later, at 5:39 p.m., Flight 305 touched down at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. The plane was directed to a remote, brightly lit section of the tarmac, far from the main terminals. The curtains on all the passenger windows were drawn, as per Cooper's instructions, to prevent police snipers from getting a clear shot. Once the plane was on the ground, a single Northwest Orient employee, wearing civilian clothes, approached the aircraft carrying the money-filled knapsack and the 4 parachutes. The items were handed to a flight attendant through the aft air stairs, the unique, retractable staircase at the rear of the 727 that would become the central feature of Cooper's daring escape plan. Cooper meticulously inspected the money and the parachutes. Satisfied, he did something that surprised everyone. He kept his word. He allowed all 36 passengers and 2 of the flight attendants, Florence Schaffner and Alice Hancock, to deplane. The passengers, who had been sitting on the plane for hours believing they were waiting out a mechanical issue, disembarked, completely oblivious to the fact that they had been hostages in a high-stakes hijacking. As they walked away, they left Dan Cooper on the plane with the captain, the first officer, the flight engineer, and 1 remaining flight attendant, Tina Mucklow. He now had his money and his parachutes. The first phase of his plan had been executed with flawless precision. But the most dangerous and audacious part of his journey was still to come. A flight back into the dark, stormy night, and a leap into history. The stage was set for an escape so bold it would become the only unsolved act of air piracy in American history. With the passengers safely off the plane and the ransom money in his possession, Dan Cooper was in complete command. He had transformed a commercial airliner into his own private getaway vehicle. On the tarmac at Seattle-Tacoma Airport, under the glare of floodlights and the unseen eyes of FBI agents, Cooper calmly laid out the second phase of his plan to the remaining crew. His instructions were bizarrely specific and displayed a surprising, almost professional knowledge of aviation. He instructed the flight crew to plot a course to Mexico City. However, he dictated the precise parameters for the flight. The plane was to fly at the absolute minimum airspeed possible without stalling, which for a Boeing 727 is approximately 100 knots. or 115 miles per hour. They were to fly at a low altitude, no higher than 10,000 feet, well below the standard cruising altitude for a jetliner. He also demanded that the landing gear remain down and that the wing flaps be lowered to a 15-degree angle. These were highly unusual flight configurations, all designed to keep the plane flying as slowly and as low as possible. Most critically, he demanded that the cabin remain unpressurized. The flight crew, particularly the pilots, were deeply concerned. These instructions were not just unusual. They were dangerous. Flying a 727 so slowly, at such a low altitude with the gear and flaps down, would burn a massive amount of fuel. Captain Scott tried to explain to Cooper that under these conditions, their range would be severely limited. They wouldn't even make it to the next state, let alone Mexico City. He told Cooper they would need to refuel again in either Reno or Sacramento. Cooper, ever the calm negotiator, agreed. They would refuel in Reno. His final instruction was the most telling and the one that revealed his ultimate escape plan. He ordered that the aft air stairs, the retractable staircase at the rear of the 727, remain down and unlocked during the flight. This was a feature unique to the 727, a staircase that could, in theory, be lowered in midair. The flight crew protested, explaining that this was not a safe or standard procedure. But Cooper was adamant. His entire plan hinged on that staircase. At approximately 7:40 p.m., after a lengthy refueling process, Northwest Orient Flight 305 took off from Seattle for its strange, slow journey south. Only 5 people were on board: Dan Cooper, Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow, Captain William Scott, First Officer William Radizak, and Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson. As per Cooper's instructions, Mucklow remained in the cabin with him while the other 3 crew members were sealed in the cockpit. Cooper told her to go into the cockpit and stay there with the door closed. He wanted to be alone. It was the last time anyone would ever see him. The flight path took them into a dark and treacherous night. A major storm system was moving through the Pacific Northwest, bringing with it heavy rain, high winds, and near-zero visibility. The plane was flying low and slow, tossed about by severe turbulence. In the cockpit, the pilots could see nothing but the black, swirling clouds outside their windows. They were flying on instruments alone, a small, fragile bubble of light in a vast, violent storm. At approximately 8 p.m., a warning light flashed on the dashboard in the cockpit. It indicated that the aft air stairs had been activated. The pressure in the cabin fluctuated. Captain Scott got on the intercom and asked Cooper, through the closed door, if he needed any assistance. Cooper's response was a single, curt word: "No." That was the last communication anyone ever had with the man known as Dan Cooper. A few minutes later, at approximately 8:13 p.m., as the plane flew over the rugged, heavily forested wilderness of southwestern Washington state, the pilots felt a sudden change in air pressure and a slight upward movement of the plane's tail section. It was a subtle but distinct shift, the kind of movement consistent with a person jumping from the aft stairs. Dan Cooper, carrying his $200,000 ransom, had strapped on a parachute, lowered the rear staircase into the howling 100-mile-per-hour wind, and leaped out into the freezing, storm-tossed darkness, somewhere over one of the most remote and unforgiving landscapes in North America. The flight continued on to Reno, Nevada. The crew, uncertain of Cooper's status, kept the cockpit door locked and did not venture back into the passenger cabin. They landed safely at Reno Tahoe Airport shortly after 10:15 p.m. The plane was immediately surrounded by a swarm of FBI agents and local police. Their weapons drawn, they boarded the aircraft, cautiously making their way down the aisle, expecting a potential confrontation. But the cabin was empty. All they found were the remnants of Cooper's presence. There was the black necktie with the mother-of-pearl clip he had left on his seat. There were 2 of the 4 parachutes he had requested, one of which had been opened and partially cannibalized, suggesting he may have used its cords to tie the money bag to himself. And there were the 8 Raleigh cigarette butts he had smoked. Dan Cooper, the man, was gone. The FBI immediately launched one of the most extensive and expensive manhunts in its history. The investigation, codenamed Norjack for Northwest Hijacking, began with a desperate attempt to pinpoint his landing zone. Based on the plane's flight path and the moment the tail section moved, they calculated a rough drop zone in the rugged wilderness near the town of Ariel, Washington. But the search area was vast and the terrain was brutal. Dense forests, steep mountains, and deep ravines. The storm on the night of the jump would have blown him far off course, making a precise landing spot impossible to calculate. A massive ground search was initiated. Hundreds of soldiers from Fort Lewis, along with FBI agents and local law enforcement, scoured the area on foot and in helicopters. They searched for months, but found nothing. No body, no parachute, no money bag, not a single shred of evidence. The wilderness had swallowed him whole. The FBI began the painstaking process of trying to identify the man himself. They had a detailed physical description from the crew, a composite sketch that was distributed nationwide, and a partial DNA profile lifted from the cigarette butts. But who was Dan Cooper? The name itself was a dead end, likely an alias. A media error soon after the hijacking mistakenly referred to the suspect as D.B. Cooper, a name that stuck in the public consciousness. Though it was never the name he used, investigators checked the backgrounds of known criminals with parachuting experience. They interviewed hundreds of potential suspects. They tracked down a man named D.B. Cooper in Oregon, but he was quickly cleared, though his name would forever be associated with the crime. The tie he left behind was analyzed for trace evidence, but the technology of the time yielded little. The identity of the quiet, polite man in the business suit was a complete and total mystery. The FBI had the what, the when, and the how, but the who and the where remained tantalizingly out of reach. Dan Cooper had executed the perfect crime, and then performed the perfect vanishing act. In the years following the hijacking, the D.B. Cooper case became a fixture of American life, a modern folktale that captured the imagination of the public. The FBI investigation, Norjack, continued relentlessly, but it was an inquiry defined by frustration and dead ends. The lack of a body, a parachute, or any sign of the ransom money created a void that was filled with an endless stream of tips, theories, and false leads. The composite sketch of the quiet, dark-suited man became one of the most famous wanted posters in history, his enigmatic face staring out from post office walls across the country. The FBI explored every conceivable angle. They investigated the possibility that Cooper was an experienced paratrooper, perhaps a disgruntled military veteran. His calm demeanor under pressure and his apparent knowledge of the 727's unique aft staircase suggested a level of expertise. They delved into the records of military paratroopers, smoke jumpers, and civilian skydivers, looking for anyone who matched the profile. But the experts they consulted pointed out serious flaws in Cooper's plan. Jumping at night into a violent storm, with winds over 100 miles per hour, into a rugged, forested terrain, wearing only a business suit and loafers, was not just dangerous. It was suicidal. The parachute he had chosen was a military-issue NB-8, a reliable but relatively primitive, non-steerable chute. His reserve chute was a training model that had been sewn shut, a detail he had failed to notice. To a professional, his plan looked less like a brilliant escape and more like a desperate, ill-informed gamble. This led to the prevailing theory within the FBI, that D.B. Cooper had not survived the jump. They believed he had likely been killed on impact or had died of exposure in the freezing, remote wilderness. His body and the ransom money, they reasoned, were lying undiscovered somewhere in the vast forests of southwestern Washington, destined to be reclaimed by nature. For years, this remained the most logical, if unsatisfying, explanation. The case produced a long and colorful list of potential suspects, each with their own compelling story. One of the earliest and most prominent was a man named Richard McCoy Jr. in 1972. Just a few months after the Cooper hijacking, McCoy, a Vietnam veteran and expert skydiver, hijacked a United Airlines flight and extorted a $500,000 ransom. His method was almost an exact copy of Cooper's, right down to the use of a fake bomb and his escape by parachute from the rear of the plane. He was caught a few days later, and many in law enforcement were convinced he was D.B. Cooper. However, McCoy had a solid alibi for the night of the Northwest Orient hijacking, and his physical description did not perfectly match the one given by the flight crew. He was convicted for the second hijacking and later killed in a shootout with the FBI after a prison escape. While the similarities are striking, most investigators now believe McCoy was a copycat, inspired by the legend Cooper had created. Another compelling suspect was a man named Dwayne Weber, who, on his deathbed in 1995, confessed to his wife, "I am Dan Cooper." After his death, his wife recalled a series of strange coincidences. He had suffered a knee injury around the time of the hijacking, which he claimed was from a jump. She found an old plane ticket with the airport code Seattle-Tacoma in his wallet, and he had once sleep-talked about leaving his fingerprints on the aft stairs. The FBI took the claim seriously enough to compare Weber's DNA to the partial profile from the cigarette butts. But it was not a match. The investigation remained in this state of suspended animation for nearly a decade. Then, in February of 1980, the case was suddenly and dramatically blown wide open. The discovery came not from a massive FBI search, but from a chance finding by a child. An 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was on a family vacation, digging a fire pit on a sandy stretch of the Columbia River at a place called Tenna. The location was miles downstream and significantly west of the suspected drop zone. As he was clearing away the sand, his hand brushed against something brittle. He pulled it out and found 3 rotting packets of cash. The bills were decomposed and bound with rubber bands. Brian's family turned the money over to the authorities. The FBI, their excitement palpable, quickly examined the find. They painstakingly separated the fragile bills and began checking the serial numbers against the list they had compiled from photographing the ransom money 9 years earlier. The results were a perfect match. This was a portion of D.B. Cooper's loot. They had found $5,800 in weathered $20 bills. The discovery was a bombshell, the first piece of concrete, physical evidence to surface since the night of the hijacking. But instead of solving the mystery, it only deepened it. How did this money get to Tenna? The location was far from the original search area. The packets were found above the high water mark, suggesting they hadn't simply washed ashore. Forensic hydrologists studied the river's currents and concluded that it was plausible the money could have been washed down a tributary and deposited there. But the way the bundles were found, still partially bound together, seemed inconsistent with a long, tumbling journey in a river. This led to a new wave of theories. Did Cooper survive the jump and land near the Columbia River, burying a portion of the money there before moving on? Or did the money bag separate from him during his descent, landing in the river and eventually washing ashore? The discovery also reinvigorated the ground search. The FBI scoured Tenna and the surrounding areas, hoping to find more money or, more importantly, a body or a parachute. They found nothing. The $5,800 found by Brian Ingram remains the only portion of the ransom ever recovered. The other $194,200 is still out there, one of the most famous lost treasures in American history. The discovery of the money seemed to support the FBI's theory that Cooper had not survived. If he had lived, why would he abandon even a small portion of his hard-won prize? It suggested a chaotic, violent end, with the money being scattered by the forces of nature. But for the true believers, the romantics who saw Cooper as a folk hero who had beaten the system, the discovery was proof of the opposite. He had survived, and this was simply the small price he had paid for his freedom. A few waterlogged bundles lost in the chaos of his escape. The find had given the public a tangible piece of the legend, but it had brought the FBI no closer to finding the man himself. The ghost in the business suit remained as elusive as ever, his fate still written on the wind. The discovery of the ransom money at Tenna in 1980 was the last major break in the D.B. Cooper case. For the next several decades, the investigation settled back into a long, quiet winter, kept alive only by the occasional new suspect or technological advance. In 2001, the FBI was able to develop a more complete DNA profile from the saliva on the cigarette butts Cooper had left behind, but it has never been matched to any individual in their databases. In 2007, they re-examined the black tie he had left on his seat using powerful new forensic technology. Scientists at the Smithsonian were able to isolate particles of pure, unalloyed titanium, a rare metal that, in 1971, was primarily used in the high-tech aerospace industry. This led to a compelling new theory, that Cooper was not a simple criminal, but perhaps an engineer, a manager, or a technician at a company like Boeing, which had a major presence in the Seattle area. This would explain his apparent knowledge of the 727 systems and his access to such exotic materials. It painted a picture of an insider, a man with a grudge against the industry, who used his specialized knowledge to commit the perfect crime. Despite these intriguing new clues, the case remained stubbornly cold. Finally, in July of 2016, after 45 years of active investigation, the FBI made a stunning announcement. They were officially closing the Norjack case. They stated that they had exhausted all credible leads and that the resources dedicated to the decades-long investigation could be better used on more pressing matters. While they would still investigate any specific physical evidence that emerged, such as the missing ransom money or Cooper's parachute, they would no longer actively pursue tips or theories. The ghost had won. The official hunt for D.B. Cooper was over. The FBI's decision, however, did little to quell the public's fascination. In fact, it only seemed to pour fuel on the fire of amateur investigation. The case has become a holy grail for a dedicated community of citizen sleuths, independent researchers, and documentarians who continue to pick apart the evidence, propose new suspects, and conduct their own searches. One of the most prominent modern suspects, championed by a team of private investigators, is a man named Robert Rackstraw, a former Army paratrooper and explosives expert with a history of criminal activity and a knack for escaping justice. Rackstraw, who died in 2019, bore a strong physical resemblance to the composite sketch and seemed to enjoy toying with the idea that he might be Cooper, though he never officially confessed. Despite a compelling circumstantial case built against him, the FBI officially stated that they had ruled him out as a suspect years earlier. The legacy of the D.B. Cooper hijacking is far-reaching and profound. In the immediate aftermath, the crime led to a complete overhaul of airport security in the United States. Before Cooper, air travel was a surprisingly casual affair. There were no metal detectors, no routine baggage checks, and it was possible to walk up to a gate and buy a ticket with cash just minutes before a flight. Cooper's hijacking exposed the system's shocking vulnerability. In response, the FAA mandated the installation of metal detectors at all airports and implemented universal screening of all passengers and their carry-on luggage. The era of casual air travel was over, and the security apparatus we know today was born. The crime also led to a specific design change in the Boeing 727. A device known as a Cooper vane was installed on all 727s, a simple aerodynamic wedge that prevents the aft air stairs from being lowered while the plane is in flight. But the most enduring legacy of D.B. Cooper is his transformation into a modern American folk hero. He is a figure who embodies a potent mix of rebellion, ingenuity, and mystery. In an era marked by the Vietnam War, social unrest, and a growing distrust of government and corporations, Cooper's act was seen by many not as a crime, but as a bold act of defiance. He was a lone man who, with quiet confidence and a well-thought-out plan, took on a major corporation and the federal government and won. He committed his crime without harming a single person, behaved like a gentleman throughout, and then vanished into the ether, seemingly pulling off the perfect getaway. He is a Rorschach test in a business suit. To some, he is a reckless, selfish criminal who endangered the lives of 42 people for personal gain and likely died a pathetic, lonely death in the wilderness. To others, he is a romantic anti-hero, a working-class legend who stuck it to the man and is now living out his days on a tropical beach, sipping a bourbon and soda, enjoying his ill-gotten gains. The fact that we don't know his true identity or his fate allows us to project whatever narrative we choose onto him. He is the ultimate blank slate. The mystery will likely never be solved. The man known as Dan Cooper, if he survived the jump, would be well over 90 years old today. The secrets of his identity, his motive, and his ultimate fate are almost certainly gone forever, lost to the wind and the rain of that stormy Thanksgiving Eve. All that remains is the legend, the story of a quiet man who, for a few brief, terrifying hours, held the world's attention, and then, with a final, daring leap, chose not just to escape, but to become a mystery himself, a ghost who fell from the sky and became a permanent fixture in the landscape of American folklore. The legend of D.B. Cooper is a story of a single, audacious act that has echoed through decades of speculation. But some mysteries are not about a single person's actions, but about the collective, silent complicity of an entire community, where a terrible secret is hidden in plain sight, and the questions left behind are not about a man who vanished, but about a body that appeared. Who put Bella in the wych elm? In the heart of England, nestled in the county of Worcestershire, lies a sprawling, ancient woodland known as Hagley Wood. It is part of the private estate of the Viscount Cobham, a place of dense canopy, tangled undergrowth, and gnarled, centuries-old trees. It is a landscape steeped in local folklore, a place of quiet beauty and whispered secrets. For generations, it has been a place for local children to play and for poachers to hunt. But in the spring of 1943, with Britain in the darkest days of the Second World War, this ancient wood would become the setting for a macabre discovery that would spawn one of the country's most enduring and enigmatic mysteries. On April 18, 1943, for teenage boys from the nearby village of Hagley, Robert Hart, Thomas Willits, Bob Farmer, and Fred Payne were out poaching for birds' nests, a common pastime for bored, adventurous youths in wartime Britain. They decided to venture into a particularly dense and foreboding section of the woods, a part of the private Hagley estate that was known to be off-limits. Their search led them to a massive, imposing wych elm tree. It was an old, hollowed-out tree, its gnarled branches reaching up like skeletal fingers, a perfect, spooky landmark in the heart of the woods. Believing the hollow trunk would be a prime spot for birds' nests, one of the boys, Bob Farmer, decided to climb it. As he peered down into the dark, cavernous hollow of the trunk, he saw something that was not a bird's nest. At first, he thought it was an animal's skull, its empty eye sockets staring up at him from the gloom. He reached down and pulled it out. As he brought it into the light, a wave of horror washed over him. It was not an animal. It was a human skull. It still had clumps of hair attached, and two crooked, decaying teeth were visible in its upper jaw. The boys were terrified. They were trespassing and poaching, and they had just stumbled upon a human body. Fearing they would get into trouble with the authorities, they made a pact of silence. They placed the skull back into the hollow of the tree and fled the woods, swearing to each other they would never speak of what they had found. The secret, they believed, was safe with them. But a secret of this magnitude is a heavy burden for a young boy to carry. The youngest of the group, Thomas Willits, was deeply disturbed by the discovery. The image of the skull haunted him. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep. The weight of the secret became unbearable. Finally, unable to keep it to himself any longer, he confessed to his parents. His father, as any responsible parent would, immediately contacted the police. The following day, a team of police officers from the Worcestershire Constabulary was dispatched to Hagley Wood. Guided by the young boys, they located the massive wych elm tree. Inside the hollow trunk, they found exactly what the boys had described. It was not just a skull, but an almost complete human skeleton. The space was so cramped that it seemed the body must have been stuffed inside while it was still warm, before rigor mortis had set in. The police carefully removed the remains, along with scraps of rotting clothing, a cheap crepe shoe, and a gold wedding ring. A forensic investigation was launched, led by Professor James Webster, a renowned pathologist from the Home Office. The examination of the remains began to paint a picture of the victim, but each detail only seemed to deepen the mystery. The skeleton belonged to a woman. She was estimated to be around 35 years old, about 5 feet tall, with mousy brown hair and irregular, crooked teeth. She had given birth at least once in her life. The cause of her death was clear. A piece of taffeta, a type of silk-like fabric, had been stuffed deep into her mouth, likely causing her to die of asphyxiation. This was not an accident or a natural death. This was a murder. Based on the state of the remains and the conditions within the hollow tree, Professor Webster was able to estimate a time of death. He concluded that the woman had been killed and placed in the tree at least 18 months prior, sometime in or before October of 1941. This was a critical finding. It meant that she had been hidden in that silent, wooden tomb for over a year and a half before being discovered. The police now had a body and a cause of death, but they had no identity. The investigation began with a massive effort to identify the victim. They checked the missing persons reports from all across the country, looking for a woman who matched the description. They conducted a meticulous search of dental records, a painstaking pre-digital process of manually comparing charts. But every search came up empty. It was as if this woman had simply ceased to exist, her absence unnoticed and unreported by anyone in the country. The clothing she was wearing was mass-produced and untraceable. The cheap wedding ring offered no clues. She was a complete Jane Doe. With no leads on her identity, the investigation stalled. The war was raging across Europe, and the resources of the British police were stretched thin. A single, unidentified body found in the woods, however mysterious, was not a top priority. The case grew cold, another unsolved file in the archives of the Worcestershire police. The woman in the wych elm seemed destined to remain a nameless, forgotten victim. But then, just before Christmas of 1943, about 8 months after the body was discovered, the mystery took a strange and public turn. A series of cryptic messages began to appear, scrawled in chalk on walls and public monuments throughout the Midlands. The graffiti was simple, written in a bold, looping script. The first one appeared on a wall in Birmingham, and it asked a question that would come to define the entire case. It read, "Who put Lubella in the wych elm?" The message was a bombshell. It was the first time a name, or at least a potential name, had been associated with the victim. It suggested that someone, somewhere, knew the identity of the woman and the secret of her death. The police were baffled. Who was writing these messages? And who was Lubella? The graffiti continued to appear, each message slightly different, but all centered around the same core question. Sometimes the name was Bella. Sometimes it was just Lubella. But the message was always the same. A public taunt, a ghostly whisper from the shadows, a challenge to the police, and a haunting reminder of the woman who lay in a nameless grave. The case, which had been a quiet, local mystery, was about to become a national obsession, a folk tale written in chalk on the walls of a nation at war. The question was no longer just who the victim was, but who was asking the question and why. The appearance of the graffiti transformed the case from a standard, if baffling, police procedural into a public mystery with a life of its own. The messages, scrawled in chalk across the industrial towns of the Midlands, were deeply unsettling. They were not the work of a random prankster. They felt personal, almost taunting. The use of a specific, unusual name, Lubella or Bella, suggested that the writer possessed intimate knowledge of the crime, knowledge that had eluded the police entirely. Was the writer the killer, a person so brazen that they were publicly flaunting their crime? Or were they a witness, someone who knew the truth but was too afraid to come forward, using the anonymous medium of graffiti to ease their conscience? The police tried to trace the source of the messages, but the writer was as elusive as a ghost. The chalk would appear on a wall one night, only to be washed away by the rain the next, leaving behind only the echo of its haunting question. As the graffiti campaign continued into 1944, the investigation, which had been dormant, was jolted back to life by a new and extraordinary theory, one that shifted the entire context of the crime from a simple domestic murder to the shadowy world of wartime espionage. The theory came from an unlikely source, a woman who contacted the police with a fantastic story about a spy ring operating in the Midlands. The woman was a local prostitute who claimed that her husband, a man who worked at a local munitions factory, had become involved with a German spy network. According to her, the network was comprised of a German spy, a Dutch national, and a British RAF officer who was feeding them information from the factory. She claimed that a member of the spy ring had been a Dutch woman who had arrived in the area in 1941. This woman, she said, had become a problem. She knew too much, she was talking too much, and she was becoming a liability to the network. One night, during a heated argument at a local pub, the woman was murdered by the German spy and the RAF officer. They had then, she claimed, taken her body out to Hagley Wood and hidden it in a hollow tree. The name of this murdered Dutch woman? Bella. This theory, while sensational, suddenly made a strange kind of sense. It provided a powerful motive for the murder and, more importantly, It explained the meticulous erasure of the victim's identity. In the world of espionage, a dead agent is a loose end that must be tied up cleanly. Removing all identifying marks from the body and clothing would be standard procedure to prevent the victim from being traced back to the spy ring. The isolated, hard to find which elm would have been the perfect hiding place for a body that needed to disappear permanently. The police took the story seriously enough to investigate, but they could never find any concrete evidence to support it. The woman's husband and the other men she named were investigated, but no spy ring was ever uncovered. The story remained a tantalizing but unproven piece of hearsay. However, years later, declassified MI5 files from the war would reveal a detail that lent a chilling new credibility to the espionage theory. The files documented the interrogation of a German agent who had been captured in Britain in 1941. The agent's name was Joseph Jacobs, and he was the last man to be executed in the Tower of London. Before his execution, Jacobs was extensively questioned by MI5. During his interrogation, he revealed a detail about his mission. He told his interrogators that his girlfriend, a German cabaret singer and actress named Clara Bowley, had also been recruited as a spy. He claimed that she was supposed to be sent to the Midlands after him, her mission scheduled to begin in 1941. The physical description of Clara Bowley was a near-perfect match for the woman found in the Wych Elm. She was around 30 years old, about 5 feet tall, and had irregular teeth that required dental work. Furthermore, her stage name, the name she was known by in the cabaret clubs of Germany, was Clarabella. The connection was electrifying. Clarabella could easily have been shortened to Bella by English-speaking associates. Had Clara Bowley, aka Clarabella, made it to England for her mission? Had she, like the woman in the prostitute story, become a liability to her own network and been silenced, her body hidden in the heart of an English wood? The theory was compelling. It would explain why she was never reported missing. Her German family would have had no way of knowing her fate during the war, and it would explain the professional erasure of her identity. But the theory remained just that. There was no proof that Clara Bowley had ever set foot in England. MI5 had no record of her arrival, and her ultimate fate remains unknown. Another similar theory emerged from a different source. In 1953, a woman named Una Mossop came forward with her own story. She claimed that her late ex-husband, a man named Jack Mossop, had confessed to her before his death that he had been involved in the murder. According to Una, Jack had been part of a small group, including a Dutchman named Van Ralt, who were involved in espionage. He told her that they would often meet at a pub in Hagley. One night, during a meeting, a Dutch woman in their circle had become drunk and passed out. The men, seeing an opportunity to get rid of a woman who knew too much, had taken her out to Hagley Wood, put her in a hollow tree, and left her there to die of exposure. Jack Mossop was apparently so terrified by what he had done that he was plagued by nightmares for the rest of his life. Repeatedly dreaming of a skull staring out at him from a hollow tree, he was eventually committed to a mental institution, where he died before the body in the Wych Elm was discovered. This story, like the others, was compelling but impossible to verify. It provided a name, a motive, and a confession, but Jack Mossop was dead. The Dutchman, Van Ralt, was a phantom who could not be traced. Una's story was simply another unprovable account, another layer of myth added to the growing legend. The case was now a tangled web of competing narratives. Was the victim a local woman, killed in a domestic dispute? Was she a Dutch spy, silenced by her own network? Or was she a German cabaret singer, a casualty of a failed intelligence mission? Each theory provided a plausible identity for Bella, but none could be proven. The graffiti, the source of the name itself, remained a mystery. It eventually stopped, the writer having either tired of their game or achieved their purpose. The question who put Bella in the Wych Elm was left hanging in the air, a piece of folkloric dust that would never settle. The identity of the woman and the secret of her death seemed to be locked away forever, as securely as her body had been locked inside the hollow tree. As the decades passed and the official investigation remained cold, the mystery of the woman in the Wych Elm began to drift out of the realm of traditional crime and espionage and into the murkier, more speculative waters of folklore and the occult. The sheer strangeness of the crime, the unusual hiding place, the ritualistic feel of the scene, and the cryptic graffiti made it fertile ground for theories that went beyond rational explanation. The ancient woods of Hagley, already steeped in local legend, became the perfect backdrop for a story that seemed to have been pulled from the pages of a dark fairy tale. One of the most enduring folkloric theories revolves around the practice of witchcraft and black magic. This theory gained traction in the 1950s, largely through the work of an anthropologist and archaeologist named Margaret Murray. Murray was a prominent, if controversial, scholar who had written extensively about the existence of a pre-Christian, pagan witch cult that she believed had survived in secret across Europe for centuries. When she learned of the details of the Hagleywood case, she saw a clear connection to what she believed were ancient occult practices. According to Murray, the placement of the body in a wych elm tree was highly significant. In many pagan and folkloric traditions, the elm tree is associated with the underworld and the goddess of death. Furthermore, the act of placing a body inside a hollow tree was, she claimed, a traditional method used by practitioners of black magic to trap a malevolent spirit or to silence a witch who knew too many secrets. The most compelling piece of evidence for this theory was a strange, related discovery. Not far from the wych elm, police had found the skeletal remains of a severed hand, buried separately. Murray connected this to an ancient ritual known as the Hand of Glory, a grimoire tradition where the severed, pickled hand of a hanged man is used as a powerful magical artifact, often in conjunction with a candle made from the man's own fat. The belief was that the Hand of Glory could induce a deep sleep or paralysis in all who saw it, making it the perfect tool for thieves and dark magicians. In Murray's interpretation, Bella was not a spy, but a witch. She was a member of a local coven who had broken their rules or threatened to expose their secrets. Her fellow witches, in an act of ritualistic execution, had killed her and placed her body in the womb of the mother goddess tree to silence her spirit forever. The severed hand, she argued, was part of this dark ritual. This theory, while academically dubious to most mainstream historians, was incredibly compelling to the public. It transformed the case from a sordid murder into a gothic horror story, a tale of ancient rites and modern-day witchcraft unfolding in the heart of wartime England. The graffiti campaign was also interpreted through this occult lens. The mysterious writer was not seen as the killer or a frightened witness, but as another member of the coven, or perhaps a rival practitioner, using a form of public magic to either curse or expose those responsible. The question, who put Bella in the wych elm, became a kind of public incantation, a way of keeping the dead woman's spirit alive and restless, preventing her killers from ever finding peace. This occult narrative, while lacking any concrete evidence, has had a powerful and lasting impact on the folklore surrounding the case. It speaks to a deep human need to find a larger, more mythic meaning in events that are simply brutally senseless. The idea of a secret war between spies is a frightening but rational concept. The idea of a secret war between witches is something else entirely. It taps into a more primal, folkloric fear of the darkness that lies just beyond the edges of our ordered world. Another, related set of theories focuses on the local community and its own hidden secrets. Some have suggested that Bella was a local woman, perhaps a Romani or Gypsy woman, who was involved in a dispute with a local man. In this version, her murder was a crime of passion or prejudice, and her body was hidden in the woods by a killer who knew the area intimately. The community, bound by a code of silence or a deep-seated suspicion of outsiders, then colluded to protect the killer, refusing to cooperate with the police investigation. The graffiti, in this context, could be seen as the act of a single, brave individual from within that closed community, trying to force the truth into the open. This theory grounds the mystery in the more mundane, but no less tragic, realities of rural life, where local disputes can fester in secret and justice can be subverted by a community's desire to protect its own. The physical evidence itself has also been the subject of endless speculation. The single gold wedding ring found with the body has led to countless theories about a secret marriage or a spurned lover. The cheap, mass-produced clothing suggests a woman of modest means, which seems to contradict the image of a sophisticated international spy. Every small detail has been picked apart and analyzed for decades, but each clue seems to point in a different direction, creating a web of contradictions that has so far proven impossible to untangle. The very name Bella is a mystery. Does it refer to Clara Bauerle, the German spy? Or was it a local nickname for an unknown woman? Some have even suggested a connection to the Italian phrase belladonna, which means beautiful woman, but is also the name of the deadly nightshade plant. A potent poison. Was the name a cryptic clue, suggesting the woman was not just beautiful, but dangerous or poisonous to those around her? As the decades have worn on, the lines between fact, theory, and pure fiction have become increasingly blurred. The story of Bella in the Wych Elm has become a campfire tale, a modern legend that has taken on a life of its own, independent of the original police investigation. The Wych Elm tree itself became a dark tourist attraction, a place of pilgrimage for those fascinated by the macabre and the unexplained, until it was eventually removed due to decay. The case remains a perfect, unsolved enigma precisely because it can accommodate so many different narratives. It can be a spy thriller, a gothic horror story, a tale of rural crime, or a domestic tragedy. The lack of a confirmed identity for the victim is the central void around which all of these stories revolve. Without a name, Bella is a blank slate, a phantom onto whom any identity can be projected. She is a woman who was so thoroughly erased in death that she has become a vessel for a multitude of stories, a ghost whose true history is forever lost, replaced by the 100 different histories we have created for her. The question, who put Bella in the Wych Elm, is so enduring not because we expect an answer, but because the question itself is the entire story. In the 21st century, the case of Bella in the Wych Elm has experienced a resurgence of interest, largely thanks to the internet and new generations of true crime enthusiasts. Cold cases have a unique power in the digital age, where global communities of amateur sleuths can collaborate, share information, and apply fresh eyes to old evidence. However, the Bella case presents a unique set of challenges. The passage of time has been brutal. Most of the original investigators, witnesses, and potential suspects have long since passed away. The physical evidence itself is largely gone. The victim's skeleton, which had been held at a university for study, was lost or misplaced sometime in the 1970s, a final, frustrating act of erasure that has made any modern forensic re-examination, such as DNA testing, impossible. What remains is the paper trail. The original police files, the declassified MI5 documents, the newspaper clippings, and the folklore. Modern researchers and authors continue to sift through these archives, hoping to find a previously overlooked connection or a detail that could finally solve the puzzle. One of the most significant modern attempts to crack the case was detailed in the book Who Put Bella in the Wych Elm, Volume 1 by author Alex Merrill. Merrill and his team conducted an exhaustive, multi-year investigation, focusing particularly on the espionage angle and the possible identity of Clara Bauerle. They traveled to Germany, dug through Stasi archives, and interviewed historians and intelligence experts. Their research uncovered compelling circumstantial evidence that linked the case to a complex web of wartime spy networks. But like all who had come before, they were unable to find the definitive smoking gun that could prove Bella and Clara were one and the same. The lack of a skeleton for DNA testing is the single greatest obstacle to ever solving the case. In a world where genetic genealogy is solving decades-old cold cases on a regular basis, the loss of Bella's remains is a profound tragedy. A DNA profile could have instantly answered the question of her ancestry, potentially linking her to a family tree and finally giving her a name. It could have confirmed or refuted the Clara Bauerle theory once and for all. Without it, the mystery is likely to remain forever in the realm of speculation. The legacy of the case is, therefore, not one of justice or resolution, but of pure, enduring mystery. It has become one of Britain's great unsolved crimes, a piece of national folklore on par with Jack the Ripper. The question, who put Bella in the Wych Elm, has transcended its origins as a piece of chalk graffiti to become a cultural touchstone. It represents a perfect storm of narrative hooks. A nameless victim, a bizarre hiding place, a backdrop of wartime espionage, and a hint of the occult. It is a story that refuses to be categorized, bleeding across the genres of true crime, spy thriller, and gothic horror. The enduring power of the story lies in its central void, the identity of Bella herself. She is a complete unknown, a ghost who appeared in the heart of a dark wood. This anonymity allows her to be whatever we want her to be. She is a tragic victim of a jealous lover, a courageous spy silenced by the enemy, a dangerous witch punished by her coven. She is every woman who has ever been lost, silenced, or erased. Her blankness is her power. It forces us to fill in the details, to become co-authors of her story. The case also serves as a haunting reminder of the chaos and dislocation of the Second World War. It was a time when millions of people were displaced, when identities were fluid, and when life was cheap. In the fog of war, it was terrifyingly easy for a person, particularly a foreigner or someone living on the fringes, to simply disappear without a trace. Bella's story is a stark illustration of that reality. She was a casualty, not just of a murderer, but of a world in turmoil, a world where a single forgotten life could be easily lost in the noise of global conflict. Today, the story lives on, primarily online and in the pages of books. The original tree is long gone, and the chalk graffiti has faded into history. But the question remains as potent and as unanswered as it was in 1943. It is a question that speaks to our deepest fears, the fear of a violent, anonymous death, and the even greater fear of being completely forgotten, of having our story, our very existence, erased from the world. Bella in the Wych Elm is destined to remain a ghost, a whisper in the woods of Hagley. Her killer or killers almost certainly took their secrets to the grave. The person who scrawled the graffiti, the one individual who seemed to hold a piece of the truth, will likely never be known. All that is left is the story itself, a perfect, self-contained mystery that has become a permanent part of British folklore. It is a chilling and timeless tale that reminds us that some secrets are so well kept, and some crimes so perfectly concealed, that they are destined to haunt us forever, not with answers, but with a single, unresolvable, and eternally whispered question. The mystery of Bella in the Wych Elm is a singular enigma, a dark fairy tale rooted in a specific time and place. But sometimes, a mystery isn't an isolated event. It's a pattern, a series of connected tragedies that point to a single, terrifying source, turning a city's most iconic feature into a hunting ground. The Texarkana Moonlight Murders. The year 1946 was supposed to be a year of profound and collective relief for America. The Second World War was over. Millions of young men were coming home, trading their uniforms for civilian clothes, their rifles for factory tools. A spirit of hard-won optimism was settling over the nation, a desire to return to the simple rhythms of peacetime life, starting families, buying homes, and looking toward a bright, uncomplicated future. In the bustling, bi-state city of Texarkana, a unique community straddling the border of Texas and Arkansas, this sense of post-war renewal was palpable. The town was thriving, a hub of commerce and transportation, a place where the anxieties of the recent past were beginning to fade, replaced by the simple, hopeful dramas of everyday life. For the young people of Texarkana, this meant a return to cherished local traditions, particularly the romantic, secluded ritual of parking on the city's quiet, unlit lovers' lanes. These remote dirt roads, winding through the scrubby pine forests on the outskirts of town, were a world unto themselves. They were sanctuaries of privacy for young couples seeking a moment of intimacy away from the watchful eyes of their parents. They were a landscape of whispered secrets, steamed-up windows, and the soft, crackling sound of a car radio playing in the darkness. They were a symbol of the town's innocence, a place that felt completely removed from the dangers of the world. But in the late winter of 1946, that innocence was about to be shattered. A shadow was beginning to fall over these lonely roads, a predator who would turn these places of youthful romance into his own private hunting grounds. The terror began on the night of Friday, February 22nd. A young couple, 25-year-old Jimmy Hollis and his 19-year-old girlfriend, Mary Jean Larry, were parked on a secluded road known locally as Rich Road. They were doing what countless other couples were doing that night, enjoying a moment of privacy after a date at the movies. Suddenly, the driver's side door was wrenched open. A powerful beam of a flashlight blinded them, and behind it stood the silhouette of a man. The man was tall, and his face was completely obscured by a crude, white mask, like a burlap sack or a pillowcase with two small holes cut out for the eyes. The man held a pistol. He ordered Jimmy Hollis out of the car. He said, "I don't want to kill you, fella, so do what I say." He marched Jimmy to the front of the car and, with brutal efficiency, struck him twice on the head with a heavy object, possibly the butt of his pistol, fracturing his skull. Jimmy collapsed to the ground, unconscious. The masked man then turned his attention to Mary Jean. He ordered her to get out of the car. Terrified, she complied. He told her to run. As she began to flee down the dark road, he changed his mind. "Never mind, girl. Get back in the car." He then ordered her to take off her panties. What happened next was an act of savage, bewildering violence. He told her to lie down on the front seat and then began to beat her with the pistol. She tried to fight back, kicking and screaming. The man, seemingly frustrated or spooked, suddenly stopped. He told her to run for the nearest house. This time he let her go. Mary Jean, bleeding and terrified, ran barefoot down the dark road until she reached a nearby home and pounded on the door for help. When the police arrived, they found Jimmy Hollis conscious but severely injured. Their attacker was long gone, having melted back into the night. The initial investigation was hampered by the victim's confused and terrified state. The attack was brutal, but it was also strange. The motive was not robbery, and the assault, while vicious, had stopped short of a fatal conclusion. The police treated it as a serious but likely isolated incident, perhaps the work of a deranged drifter or a lone sadist. The community was shaken, but there was no sense yet that this was the beginning of something far more sinister. Exactly 1 month later, the true nature of the threat became horrifyingly clear. On the night of Sunday, March 24th, another young couple, 29-year-old Richard Griffin and his 17-year-old girlfriend, Polly Ann Moore, disappeared after a date. They were a well-liked, respectable couple. Richard was a decorated Navy veteran, recently returned from the war. Polly was a quiet, popular girl. When they failed to return home, their families reported them missing. The next morning, a passing motorist spotted Richard's car, a 1941 Oldsmobile sedan, parked on another secluded lover's lane, Rich Road, not far from the scene of the first attack. The police arrived to a scene of quiet horror. The car was empty, but a short distance away, lying in a ditch just off the road, they found the bodies of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore. Both had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. There were signs of a struggle. Polly Ann's body showed evidence that she had been brutally assaulted before she was killed. The killer had used a .32 caliber pistol, the same type of weapon described by the survivors of the first attack. The connection was undeniable and terrifying. The community's worst fears were realized. The assault on Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry was not an isolated event. It was a prelude. A killer was stalking the lovers' lanes of Texarkana, a predator who was escalating his violence with chilling speed. The press seized upon the story, and the city was gripped by a palpable sense of fear. The romantic, secluded backroads were no longer seen as sanctuaries of privacy, but as death traps. The police were now under immense pressure, but they had very little to go on. The only description of the killer was that of a tall man in a crude white hood. The weapon was a common caliber. There was no physical evidence left at the scene. He was a phantom, a faceless, motiveless specter who emerged from the darkness, killed, and then vanished. The local newspapers, reflecting the growing panic, began to refer to him by a name that would become etched in the annals of American crime: the Phantom Killer. The age of post-war optimism in Texarkana was over. An age of terror had begun. Every sunset now brought with it a new wave of fear, a collective dread that settled over the city like a shroud. The phantom had struck twice, and everyone knew, with a cold, terrifying certainty, that he would strike again. In the weeks following the murders of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, a palpable sense of dread descended upon Texarkana. The city's youthful innocence had been replaced by a grim, adult fear. The lovers' lanes, once a symbol of romance and freedom, were now deserted. their dusty tracks holding only the memory of a recent horror. The police force, a combination of officers from both the Texas and Arkansas sides of the city, was stretched to its limit, struggling to find any lead in a case that had no witnesses, no clear motive, and a killer who seemed to be a ghost. They increased patrols, questioned known criminals and drifters, and urged the public to be vigilant. But they were hunting a shadow, and the entire community knew with a sickening certainty that the phantom was not finished. They didn't have to wait long. The killer's cycle was terrifyingly predictable. He seemed to operate on a 3-week schedule, a rhythm that was as reliable as the phases of the moon. And just as the community began to dare to breathe again, he struck once more. On the night of Saturday, April 13th, 1946, a 15-year-old girl named Betty Jo Booker was playing the saxophone with her band, the Rhythmaries, at the local VFW hall. She was a bright, talented musician, a popular student at a local high school. After the gig, she was seen talking to a friend, 17-year-old Paul Martin. Paul had offered to give her a ride home. The two were seen leaving the VFW hall together shortly after midnight. It was the last time they were seen alive. When Betty Jo failed to return home, her parents immediately called the police. The pattern was horrifyingly familiar. The next morning, Paul Martin's car was found parked at the edge of Spring Lake Park, another one of the city's well-known secluded spots. A massive search of the park began. A few hours later, the searchers made the first grim discovery. They found the body of Paul Martin, lying on his side by a fence at the north end of the park. He had been shot 4 times. A short distance away, hidden behind a large oak tree, they found the body of Betty Jo Booker. She had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in the face. The murder weapon, police determined, was the same .32 caliber automatic pistol that had been used in the murders of Griffin and Moore. The most chilling and bizarre clue, however, was found with Betty Jo's body. It was her own saxophone, still in its case, lying on the ground near her. The detail was so strange, so out of place, that it only deepened the mystery and the horror. Why would the killer leave the saxophone behind? Was it a trophy he had decided to discard? Or was it a deliberate, taunting signature, a message to the police and the public? The presence of the instrument added a layer of surreal, almost artistic cruelty to the crime, suggesting a killer who was not just brutal, but psychologically twisted. With this third attack, the city of Texarkana plunged into a state of outright panic. The phantom killer was no longer a vague threat. He was a very real and present monster, a hunter who was stalking their children with methodical precision. The local hardware stores sold out of guns, ammunition, and window locks. People began barricading their doors at night. The city's teenagers were placed under a voluntary, but strictly enforced curfew. The streets of Texarkana, once bustling with post-war life, became eerily silent after dark. The pressure on the police department was now immense, and they knew they were out of their depth. They called for outside help, and one of the most famous and respected lawmen in the country answered the call. Captain M.T. Lone Wolf Gonzalez of the Texas Rangers. Gonzalez was a legend, a tough, no-nonsense ranger from the old school. He arrived in Texarkana with his pearl-handled revolvers and his reputation for always getting his man. His presence was meant to reassure the terrified public, to bring a sense of order to the chaos. He set up a command post in the city hall and took charge of the sprawling bi-state investigation. Gonzalez and his team of rangers, working with the local police, re-examined every piece of the scant evidence. They theorized that the killer was a cunning individual with a powerful sadistic streak, someone who derived pleasure from the terror he was inflicting on the community. They believed he was likely a local man, someone who knew the back roads and secluded spots of Texarkana intimately. He was probably intelligent, methodical, and forensically aware, careful not to leave behind any fingerprints or other evidence. The white hood he wore suggested a desire not just to conceal his identity, but to create a terrifying, almost supernatural persona. Despite Gonzalez's expertise and the intensified investigation, the killer remained a ghost. The police were inundated with tips, many of them born of the town's paranoia. Neighbors began to suspect neighbors. Anyone who seemed strange or reclusive came under suspicion. The police investigated hundreds of leads, but each one was a dead end. The Phantom had left them nothing to work with but a handful of .32 caliber shell casings and a community paralyzed by fear. As the weeks ticked by, the 3-week cycle that had defined the killer's pattern began to loom large in the public's mind. Everyone was counting the days, waiting for the next full moon, waiting for the Phantom to strike again. But this time, the killer would change his pattern. He would move away from the secluded lovers' lanes and bring his reign of terror directly into the homes of his victims, proving that no one, no matter where they were, was truly safe. The next attack would be the most brazen and the most brutal of all, and it would leave behind the one thing the police had been so desperately lacking: a survivor who had seen the Phantom's face. The city of Texarkana held its collective breath as the 3rd week of April passed into the 4th, and then into May. The Phantom Killer's terrifying 3-week cycle had been broken. The full moon came and went without another attack. A fragile, tentative sense of relief began to seep back into the community. Perhaps, some hoped, the killer had moved on, or had been spooked by the massive police presence and the arrival of the legendary Texas Ranger, Lone Wolf Gonzalez. The curfews were relaxed, and the rhythms of daily life began to slowly return to a semblance of normalcy. But the Phantom was not gone. He was simply waiting, changing his methods, and preparing for his most audacious and terrifying attack yet. On the night of Friday, May 3rd, 1946, the killer abandoned the secluded lovers' lanes and moved into the heart of the community itself. He targeted a remote farmhouse on the Arkansas side of the county, about 10 miles outside of Texarkana. The home belonged to a 37-year-old farmer named Virgil Starks and his wife, Katie. It was a quiet, isolated property, a place that should have been a sanctuary. That evening, Virgil was sitting in his armchair in the living room, listening to the radio. Katie was in their bedroom. Suddenly, the tranquility was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. Virgil turned toward the window just as 2 shots rang out from the darkness outside. The bullets tore through the window and into Virgil's head and back. He slumped forward in his chair, mortally wounded. Katie, hearing the shots, rushed into the living room to a scene of horror. As she knelt beside her dying husband, she saw the killer's face appear in the broken window. He was not wearing his signature white hood. For the first time, his face was visible, silhouetted against the dark night. She saw a young man and he was holding a pistol. He told her to give him the keys to her car. Terrified, she ran to the phone to call for help, but the line was dead. The killer had cut the phone lines before the attack, another sign of his methodical planning. Katie's mind raced. Her only escape was to run. She fled out the back of the house and ran barefoot through the dark fields to her nearest neighbor's home, half a mile away. The killer, for reasons that remain unknown, did not pursue her. Perhaps he was satisfied with his primary target, or perhaps he was spooked by her escape. He simply vanished back into the night. When the police arrived, they found Virgil Starks dead in his armchair. The killer had used the same .32 caliber automatic pistol as in the previous murders, but this time he had left something crucial behind: a survivor who had seen his face. Katie Starks provided the police with the first and only physical description of the Phantom Killer. She described him as a young man, possibly in his late 20s, with a dark complexion. It was not much to go on, but it was more than they had ever had before. The attack on the Starks farm sent a new and even more terrifying wave of panic through the region. The Phantom was no longer just a threat to teenagers in parked cars. He was a home invader, a killer who could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. The belief that one could be safe behind locked doors was shattered. The city descended into a state of near-total lockdown. People armed themselves, businesses closed early, and the streets were deserted after dark. The investigation was now focused on finding a man who fit Katie Starks's vague description. The pressure to make an arrest was immense, and it was in this climate of intense fear and pressure that the investigation finally zeroed in on a prime suspect, a 29-year-old local man named Yowell Swinney. Swinney was a career criminal, a small-time car thief, counterfeiter, and thug with a long and violent rap sheet. He was known to the local police as a habitual offender and a deeply unsavory character. On the surface, he seemed like a perfect fit for the Phantom. He was the right age, had a dark complexion, and was known to be violent. More importantly, his own wife, Peggy, had come to the police with a damning story. Peggy Swinney, who was in the process of a bitter divorce, told investigators that her husband was the Phantom killer. She claimed that he had confessed the murders to her, and she provided details that seemed to align with the evidence from the crime scenes. She told police that he had stolen a .32 caliber pistol. She described how he would disappear for hours on the nights of the murders and return home late, his clothes muddy. She even claimed that he had forced her to drive the getaway car after one of the attacks. Her testimony was a bombshell, the direct insider account that the police had been so desperate for. Based on Peggy's statements, Yowell Swinney was arrested. The police from both Arkansas and Texas were convinced they had their man. They interrogated him for hours, but he steadfastly denied any involvement. The case against him, while compelling, rested almost entirely on the testimony of his estranged wife. And Peggy, it turned out, was a problematic witness. She was known to be an unreliable source, and her story changed multiple times under questioning. She would provide a detailed account one day, only to recant it the next, claiming the police had pressured her. Her credibility began to crumble. The police tried to corroborate her story with physical evidence. They searched for the murder weapon, the .32 caliber pistol she claimed Yowell had owned, but they never found it. They had no fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no confession. The only other person who could potentially identify him was Katie Starks, the survivor of the final attack. They brought her in for a lineup, but she was unable to definitively identify Yowell Swinney as the man she had seen in her window. The case against him, which had seemed so strong, was beginning to fall apart. Despite the weak evidence, the authorities were not willing to let him go. They managed to convict him on unrelated car theft charges, and he was sentenced to life in prison as a habitual offender. The public was told that the man responsible for the Moonlight murders was now behind bars, and the city of Texarkana breathed a collective sigh of relief. The attacks stopped. The reign of the Phantom seemed to be over, but the truth was far more complicated. Yowell Swinney was never charged with, let alone convicted of, the Texarkana murders. The man who was widely believed to be the Phantom killer was in prison, but the case itself remained officially unsolved. The community had found a scapegoat to calm their fears, but the ghost who had haunted their town was, in the eyes of the law, still at large. With Yowell Swinney behind bars, a fragile peace returned to Texarkana. The Moonlight murders, as they had come to be known, ceased as abruptly as they had begun. To the public, the connection was clear. Swinney was the Phantom, and his imprisonment had ended the reign of terror. The city slowly began to heal, its collective trauma fading into a dark and unsettling local legend. But for the investigators and for many who followed the case closely, the resolution was deeply unsatisfying. The evidence against Swinney was entirely circumstantial, hinging on the testimony of a single, unreliable witness, his estranged wife. The fact that he was never tried for the murders left a permanent question mark hanging over the case. Was he truly the Phantom, or was he simply a convenient villain, a known criminal who was sacrificed to quell a city's panic? The case against Swinney continued to weaken over the years. His wife, Peggy, recanted her testimony multiple times, further eroding her credibility. Without her cooperation, the prosecution had no case at all. Yowell Swinney, for his part, maintained his innocence in the murders until his death in prison in 1994. He served his time as a car thief and a habitual offender, but he was never legally branded as the Phantom killer. This lack of a definitive resolution has left the case open to a wide range of alternative theories. Some investigators, including Lone Wolf Gonzalez himself, remained skeptical that a small-time crook like Swinney was capable of the cunning and psychological terror displayed by the Phantom. They believed the killer was a more intelligent, more sophisticated sadist. Over the decades, other suspects have been proposed. One of the most compelling is a theory that the killer was a German POW from a nearby internment camp who had escaped, carried out the murders, and then disappeared back into the chaos of post-war Europe. Another theory points to a different local criminal, a man who bore a resemblance to the composite sketch and had a history of violence against women. But like the case against Swinney, these theories are built on speculation and circumstantial evidence, not on proof. The Phantom Killer was one of the first serial killers to capture the American national consciousness in the post-war era. He was a new kind of monster, a motiveless, faceless predator who seemed to kill for the sheer pleasure of it. He was not a gangster or a robber. He was a specter who emerged from the darkness and disappeared back into it, leaving behind only terror and death. His methodology, the targeting of young couples in secluded lovers' lanes, would become a terrifying trope in American culture, echoed by later killers like the Zodiac. The case had a profound and lasting cultural impact, most notably as the inspiration for the classic 1976 horror film, The Town That Dreaded Sundown. The film, while taking significant creative liberties, was a fictionalized account of the Texarkana murders. It was shot on location in Texarkana and featured many locals as extras. The film transformed the local tragedy into a piece of national folklore, cementing the image of the Phantom, with his terrifying burlap sack hood, as an iconic horror movie villain. For many people, their only knowledge of the case comes from this film, which has further blurred the lines between historical fact and cinematic fiction. The legacy of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders is one of fear, uncertainty, and the enduring power of an unsolved mystery. It is a story that speaks to a deep, primal fear, the fear of the unknown predator in the darkness, the monster who can strike without reason and without warning. The Phantom was more than just a man. He was a symbol of the fragility of peace and the dark, violent currents that can run just beneath the surface of a quiet, ordinary town. The true identity of the Phantom Killer will likely never be known. The physical evidence is long gone. The witnesses have passed away. The secrets of those bloody nights in 1946 are lost to time. Was it Yowell Swinney, the career criminal who was never convicted? Was it a forgotten drifter, a German POW, or another local man who took his secrets to the grave? Or was the Phantom something else entirely? A ghost who simply walked out of the East Texas woods, held a city in his terrifying grip for one bloody spring, and then vanished forever? The case remains officially unsolved, a cold, dark file in the archives of both the Texas and Arkansas police departments. It is a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we never see, the faceless phantoms who haunt our history not with who they were, but with what they did, and with the chilling knowledge that they got away with it. The lovers' lanes of Texarkana are quiet now, but the ghost of the man in the white hood still lingers, a permanent and unsettling fixture in the landscape of American crime. The terror of the Phantom Killer was born from the specific anxieties of a post-war America. But some crimes are timeless, their horror rooted not in a specific era, but in the universal fear of the unknown, of a cryptic message left on a dead man's body on a lonely beach, the disappearance of Maura Murray in the stark, cold landscape of a New England winter. Some secrets are kept not by people, but by the woods themselves. The White Mountains of New Hampshire are a place of rugged, uncompromising beauty, a wilderness of granite peaks and dense, silent forests that can swallow sound and light. It is a place where a person can feel profoundly alone, a landscape that is both a sanctuary and a trap. And on a frigid Monday night in February of 2004, on a lonely stretch of road at the edge of this wilderness, a promising young woman would step out of her car and into a mystery that has haunted her family, law enforcement, and an entire generation of online sleuths for 2 decades. The woman at the center of this story was Maura Murray. At 21 years old, she was a study in bright, determined potential. She was a gifted athlete, a high school track star, and a former cadet at the prestigious United States Military Academy at West Point. After leaving West Point for reasons that were never fully clear, she had enrolled in the highly competitive nursing program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She was a Dean's List student, holding down a part-time job, and was in a long-term relationship with her college sweetheart, Billy Roche, an Army lieutenant stationed in Oklahoma. To the outside world, Maura was a picture of success and stability, a young woman with a clear and promising future ahead of her. But in the weeks and months leading up to her disappearance, A series of strange and troubling cracks had begun to appear in this perfect facade. Maura was navigating a period of intense, unspoken turmoil. A few months prior, she had been caught using a stolen credit card to order food, a minor crime that was set to be dismissed if she stayed out of trouble for 3 months. Then, just 3 days before she vanished, on the night of Thursday, February 5th, she was involved in a conversation with her father, Fred Murray, that left him concerned. They had gone car shopping, and later that evening, Fred had allowed Maura to borrow his new Toyota Corolla to attend a party on campus. In the early hours of Saturday morning, at around 3:30 a.m., Maura, on her way back to her father's motel, crashed his car into a guardrail, causing nearly $10,000 in damage. The accident was investigated, but no charges were filed. It was another unsettling incident in a string of recent troubles. The final weekend before she disappeared was marked by a profound and sudden shift in her behavior. Her father returned to his home in Massachusetts. Maura was left to deal with the insurance paperwork and the reality of her wrecked car. She spoke to her boyfriend, Billy, on the phone Saturday night. Their conversation was normal, but something happened after that call. On Sunday, she spoke to her father, who recalled that she seemed zoned out and unresponsive. The most bizarre and telling event occurred that night, during her shift at her campus security job. Just after midnight, her supervisor found her in a state that was later described as catatonic. She was staring blankly into space, her eyes filled with tears, completely unresponsive. The supervisor had to walk her back to her dorm room. The cause of this sudden, intense emotional breakdown remains one of the central unanswered questions of the entire case. On the morning of Monday, February 9th, Maura Murray began to methodically erase her life at UMass. She used her personal computer to search MapQuest for directions to the Berkshire Mountains in Massachusetts and to Burlington, Vermont. She made a phone call to a condominium association in Bartlett, New Hampshire, a place her family had vacationed at in the past. She packed a large duffel bag with a selection of clothing, her textbooks, and a supply of birth control pills. She then neatly placed the art from her walls on top of her packed boxes, as if she were moving out. At 12:55 p.m., she sent a strange and cryptic email to her boyfriend, Billy. It began, "I got your message." Though he had not left one, it continued, "I love you more, stud. I got the phone call back from the people. I'll talk to you tonight. I love you." At 1:24 p.m., she sent an email to a professor at the nursing school, as well as to her work supervisor, telling them that there had been a death in her family and that she would be gone for a week. This was a lie. There had been no death in her family. After sending the emails, Maura left the UMass campus in her black 1996 Saturn sedan. She drove to a nearby ATM and withdrew $280, almost the entire contents of her bank account. She then went to a liquor store, where she purchased about $40 worth of alcohol, including a box of Franzia wine, Kahlua, and Bailey's Irish Cream. She was captured on the liquor store's surveillance camera, alone and seemingly calm. Then, she got back in her car and began to drive north, into the fading light of the winter afternoon, toward the mountains. At approximately 7:27 p.m., on a dark, unlit and snowbanked stretch of Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire, a local resident named Faith Westman heard a loud thump outside her home. She looked out her window and saw a car, Maura's black Saturn, spun around and resting against a snowbank on the wrong side of the road. She had apparently lost control on a sharp hairpin turn. Another resident, a school bus driver named Butch Atwood, was driving by at that moment. He stopped his bus and approached the car. He saw a young woman inside who was not visibly injured but was clearly shaken and cold. Atwood offered to call the police for her. Maura's response was immediate and insistent. "Don't call the police," she pleaded. She told him she had already called AAA for a tow truck, a statement that was later found to be untrue, as cell service was almost non-existent in that remote area. Atwood, respecting her wishes but feeling that something was not right, continued on to his home just a few hundred feet down the road. Once there, despite Maura's request, he made a call to the Grafton County Sheriff's Department. The call was logged at 7:43 p.m. The The first police officer, a Haverhill police sergeant named Cecil Smith, arrived on the scene at 7:50 p.m., less than 10 minutes after Atwood's call. He found the black Saturn, locked, resting against the snowbank, a small crack spiderwebbed across the windshield. Inside the car, he could see a box of wine on the back seat and a Coke bottle that smelled of alcohol. A AAA card was visible on the dashboard, but the driver was gone. There were no footprints in the deep snow leading into the woods on either side of the road. There was no sign of a struggle. Maura Murray, the promising nursing student who had fled her life under a cloud of lies and strange behavior, had simply vanished from the dark roadside in the space of less than 10 minutes, leaving behind only her car, her belongings, and a mystery that would grow deeper and more complex with each passing year. The disappearance of Maura Murray from the side of Route 112 was, from the very beginning, a case defined by a frustrating lack of evidence and a surplus of perplexing questions. When Sergeant Cecil Smith arrived at the crash scene, the car was cold and locked. The immediate vicinity offered no clues. The undisturbed snow surrounding the vehicle suggested Maura hadn't wandered off into the dense, dark woods. The most logical conclusion was that she had willingly accepted a ride from a passing motorist. But who, and why was she so adamant about not involving the police? The initial police response treated the case as that of a missing person, not necessarily a victim of foul play. The prevailing theory among law enforcement was that Maura, who had been drinking and had just been in a car accident, her second in 3 days, was afraid of getting a DUI. They believed she had likely accepted a ride from someone to get away from the scene, with the full intention of returning later to deal with the car. Perhaps she had gotten a ride to a nearby town, found a motel, and was simply lying low. Or perhaps, in a more tragic version of this theory, she had attempted to walk through the woods to avoid being seen on the road, became disoriented in the dark, and succumbed to the brutal New Hampshire winter. Hypothermia can set in with terrifying speed in such conditions, and a person suffering from it can become confused and paradoxical, even burrowing into the snow for warmth in their final moments. But as the days turned into weeks with no sign of Maura, this lost-in-the-woods theory began to seem less and less likely. A massive search was launched involving New Hampshire Fish and Game, the state police, and numerous volunteer groups. They scoured the woods for miles around the crash site. They used thermal imaging cameras and search dogs. The dogs were able to pick up Maura's scent at the crash scene, but the trail ended abruptly about 100 feet down the road, lending further credence to the theory that she had gotten into a vehicle. Despite the extensive and repeated searches, not a single trace of Maura was ever found. No body, no scraps of clothing, no footprints, nothing. The woods, it seemed, had kept their secrets. As the official investigation struggled to find leads, Maura's family, led by her determined father, Fred, launched their own parallel investigation. Fred Murray was relentless. He traveled to New Hampshire almost every weekend, conducting his own searches, plastering the area with missing person flyers, and keeping his daughter's story in the media. He was critical of the police investigation, believing they had made crucial errors in the early stages and were too quick to dismiss the possibility of foul play. The family was convinced that Maura had been abducted. They believed that a predatory local, an opportunistic killer, had been driving down Route 112 that night, saw a young woman in a vulnerable situation with a disabled car, and seized the opportunity. In this scenario, Maura's pleas for Butch Atwood not to call the police had a terrible, ironic consequence. In her attempt to avoid a minor legal trouble, she had inadvertently waved away her only potential protector, leaving herself alone on a dark road with a killer. This theory of a local predator gained some traction when investigators began to look into the backgrounds of people living in the immediate area. A few individuals with histories of violence or strange behavior were looked at, but no direct evidence ever linked any of them to Maura's disappearance. One particularly strange lead involved a young local man who had a history of erratic behavior. His girlfriend later came forward to police with a disturbing story. She claimed that on the night Maura disappeared, the man had come home with a bloody knife. The knife was taken into evidence and tested, but the blood was not a match for Maura. The lead, like so many others, went nowhere. The contents of Mora's car provided another set of baffling clues. The police found her backpack, her textbooks, her birth control pills, and the alcohol she had purchased. But her wallet, her cell phone, and her car keys were missing. This suggested she had taken them with her, which would be consistent with someone who planned to return. However, the discovery of her packed duffel bag, her printed-out directions, and the emails she had sent created a powerful counternarrative. This was not a person who was simply going for a drive. This was a person who was running away. This tandem driver theory became one of the most complex and enduring explanations for her disappearance. Posits that Mora was not alone. She was traveling in tandem with another person in another car, and her crash on Route 112 was an unplanned accident. The person in the other car, the theory goes, simply picked her up and they continued on their journey, staging the disappearance to allow Mora to start a new life somewhere else, perhaps in Canada. The motive for such a drastic act remains a subject of intense speculation. Was she pregnant and trying to escape the pressures of her life? Was she involved in something illegal? Or was she simply overwhelmed by the recent car accident, the credit card fraud, and the emotional turmoil of her life, and decided to enact a desperate, pre-planned escape? This theory is compelling because it accounts for the strange preparations she made before she left. The packed bags, the emails, the withdrawal of money. It also explains why she vanished so quickly and so completely from the roadside. But it also has significant problems. Who was this second driver? No one in her life, not her family, not her boyfriend, not her closest friends, has ever come forward to say they were involved. And if she did successfully start a new life, how has she managed to remain completely off the grid, without a single confirmed sighting, in an age of ubiquitous digital footprints? To believe this theory is to believe that a 21-year-old woman, with the help of an unknown accomplice, orchestrated and has maintained a perfect, 2-decade-long disappearance. The two dominant theories, foul play at the hands of a local predator, or a pre-planned disappearance with a tandem driver, represent the two poles of the Mora Murray case. One is a story of a tragic, random victim. The other is a story of a troubled but determined agent of her own destiny. The evidence can be bent to fit either narrative. Her insistence on not calling the police could be the plea of a frightened young woman trying to avoid a DUI, or it could be the desperate attempt of someone trying to execute a secret plan without official interference. The packed bags could be the preparations for a new life, or they could simply be the ununpacked luggage of a college student who had just spent the weekend at her father's place. Every clue is a double-edged sword, a piece of a puzzle that fits into two completely different pictures. The truth, it seemed, was lost in the ambiguity of Mora's own secrets. As the official police investigation stalled and the years began to pass, the Mora Murray case took on a new life in a new and burgeoning arena. The Internet. Her disappearance occurred at a pivotal moment in the history of communication, at the dawn of the social media age and the rise of online true crime communities. Her case, with its compelling, youthful victim and its wealth of bizarre, contradictory clues, was perfectly suited for the kind of deep, obsessive, and often collaborative investigation that online forums and message boards could provide. Mora Murray became one of the first, and arguably the most famous, Internet unsolved mystery. A massive global community of amateur detectives, operating on platforms like Reddit, web sleuths, and dedicated blogs, began to pick apart every single detail of the case. They analyzed the timeline of her last days with a minute-by-minute precision. They debated the meaning of her cryptic email to her boyfriend. They scrutinized the CCTV footage from the liquor store. They used Google Earth to virtually walk the stretch of Route 112 where she disappeared. This online community, driven by a genuine desire to find answers and a fascination with the puzzle, has kept Mora's case in the public eye for 2 decades. They have uncovered new leads, interviewed peripheral witnesses, and forced law enforcement to re-examine evidence. This digital sleuthing has been both a blessing and a curse for the case. On one hand, it has generated an unprecedented level of public engagement and has unearthed details that might have otherwise been lost. But on the other hand, it has created a chaotic storm of misinformation, unfounded accusations, and wild conspiracy theories. Local residents have been harassed, their lives turned upside down by online detectives who have convinced themselves of their guilt. The Murray family has been subjected to endless, often painful, speculation about their own lives and their potential involvement. The line between helpful investigation and harmful intrusion has often been blurred. The online obsession has also given rise to a number of more esoteric and stranger theories that attempt to explain the seemingly inexplicable elements of the case. One theory, for example, focuses on the strange detail of a rag found stuffed into the tailpipe of Maura's Saturn. This was a trick sometimes used by older generations to prevent a car from starting, though it would not have been effective on a modern car like Maura's. Fred Murray, her father, has long believed that this was a sign of foul play, a clue that someone had tampered with the car. However, he also admitted that he himself had once told Maura to do this if she ever found herself stranded, as a way to signal that the car was disabled. Was the rag a sign of a killer's intervention, or was it Maura herself, following her father's old advice in a moment of panic? It's another clue that points in two opposite directions. The digital investigation has also focused intensely on Maura's state of mind. What was the source of the profound emotional distress she was clearly experiencing in the days and hours before she vanished? What happened during her catatonic episode at work? The truth is likely a complex combination of factors. She was under immense pressure. The looming consequences of the credit card fraud, the stress of the nursing program, the guilt and financial burden of wrecking her father's new car, and potential unknown troubles in her relationship with her boyfriend, Billy, could have created a perfect storm of anxiety and depression. Some have speculated that there was a secret pregnancy, or that she was involved in an affair. Others have pointed to a darker possibility, that she was the victim of an unreported crime, perhaps a sexual assault, that had left her traumatized and desperate to escape her environment. This could explain her sudden desire to flee, her lack of trust in authority, and her emotional breakdown. One of the most enduring and debated online theories centers on a specific local individual, a man who lived just a short distance from the crash site. This theory, pieced together by a documentary filmmaker and a group of online researchers, alleges that this man, along with his brother, may have been involved. The theory hinges on a series of circumstantial connections, second-hand witness statements, and alleged inconsistencies in the man's alibi. Proponents of this theory believe that these men were predatory locals who happened upon Maura's accident, offered her a ride, and then abducted and murdered her. They point to a search of the man's home years later, where police, acting on a tip, found suspicious items and used cadaver dogs that allegedly signaled the presence of human remains. However, no physical evidence directly linking this individual to Maura has ever been found, and he has never been officially named as a suspect by law enforcement. He remains a figure of intense speculation in the online world, a potential solution to the puzzle that has never been proven. The internet has also ensured that the case remains active in a very real sense. Podcasters, YouTubers, and documentary filmmakers continue to produce a steady stream of content about Maura, keeping her story alive and introducing it to new audiences. This constant media attention has led to new physical searches. In recent years, private search teams, often funded by podcast listeners or crowd-funded campaigns, have conducted new searches in the woods near the crash site, using ground-penetrating radar and other advanced technologies. In 2022, a search of a cellar foundation near the crash site, based on a new tip, was conducted with the cooperation of state police. Like all the searches before it, it yielded nothing. The Maura Murray case has become a meta-mystery, a story not just about a missing person, but about the nature of a modern investigation itself. It is a case that has been shaped as much by the actions of law enforcement and the family as it has by the collective, chaotic, and sometimes brilliant mind of the internet. The digital world has created 1,000 different versions of Maura, 1,000 different theories to explain her disappearance. But the sheer volume of information has, in some ways, only served to deepen the shadows. The core of the mystery remains as impenetrable as it was on that cold February night in 2004. A young woman, running from something or to something, drove her car into a snowbank on a dark road and stepped out of her life and into a digital legend, leaving a world of unanswered questions behind her. 2 decades have now passed since Maura Murray vanished on a lonely New Hampshire road, and the case is no closer to being solved than it was in the first frantic weeks of the investigation. The mystery endures, a testament to the profound difficulty of finding a person who does not want to be found, or who has been expertly hidden. The lack of any physical evidence remains the single greatest obstacle. In an age of forensic miracles, the Maura Murray case is a frustrating anomaly, a crime scene that yielded no body, no weapon, and no DNA evidence of a third party. All that remains is the car, its silent contents, and the digital ghost of Maura's last known activities. The two dominant theories, abduction by a local predator versus a planned disappearance, continue to be debated with a religious fervor by those who follow the case. Each theory offers a framework to explain the bizarre collection of facts, but neither can do so perfectly. The foul play theory provides a chillingly simple explanation for her disappearance. She was the victim of a random, opportunistic crime. It accounts for the suddenness of her vanishing and the complete lack of any communication since. The winding backroads of rural New England, like any isolated area, can hold their own dangers, and the story of a lone woman stranded on a dark road is a timeless and terrifying archetype of vulnerability. The weakness of this theory, however, lies in the sheer professionalism of the crime. How could a random local criminal abduct and dispose of a person so perfectly that not a single shred of physical evidence has been found in 20 years of searching? The planned disappearance theory, on the other hand, accounts for the strange preparations Maura made before she left. The packed bags, the lies to her professors, the cash withdrawal, and the directions to a new destination. It paints her as an agent of her own destiny, a young woman in crisis who made a deliberate choice to escape her life. The final crash on Route 112 was simply an unforeseen complication in her well-laid plan, a moment of bad luck that she was able to overcome with the help of a waiting accomplice. This theory is powerful because it gives Maura a sense of agency, but it too has profound weaknesses. It requires us to believe in the existence of a secret accomplice who has remained silent for 2 decades, and it requires us to believe that Maura, a person deeply connected to her family, could willingly inflict a lifetime of pain and uncertainty upon them without a single word. For her father, Fred, who has dedicated his life to finding her, this possibility is unthinkable. In the end, the truth may lie somewhere in the murky space between these two poles. It's possible that both theories are partially correct. Maura may have been running away, with no specific plan other than to get away for a few days to clear her head. She may have been driving towards the mountains, a place of solace from her childhood, intending to check into a motel and figure things out. The car crash was an accident, and then, in that moment of profound vulnerability, alone on a dark road, in a state of emotional distress, and likely having been drinking, she encountered the wrong person at the wrong time. In this scenario, she was both a runaway and a victim, a person whose own desperate choices led her directly into the path of an unforeseen and fatal danger. The legacy of the Maura Murray case is a complex one. It is a story of a family's unending grief and a father's relentless quest for answers. It is a landmark case in the history of internet sleuthing, a powerful example of how public engagement can both help and hinder a police investigation. And it is a chilling reminder of the thousands of missing persons cases that go cold each year, their families left in a state of ambiguous loss, unable to grieve and unable to move on. Maura's story resonates so deeply because it is a story about the secrets we all keep. It shows how a person can present a facade of success and stability to the world, while privately grappling with a world of turmoil. The question of what was happening in Maura's mind during her final days is as much a part of the mystery as what happened to her on that road. She is a symbol of the unknowable depths of another person's inner life. Today, the Black Saturn is no longer in a police impound lot. Her belongings have been returned to her family. The stretch of Route 112 where she crashed is marked by a simple blue ribbon tied to a tree, a quiet, roadside memorial maintained by her family and supporters. The woods of the White Mountains remain silent. The case is still officially open, a cold case that is passed from one generation of detectives to the next. Maura Murray stepped out of her car and into a modern American myth. Her face, a picture of a smiling, vibrant young woman, is now one of the most famous faces in the world of the missing. She is forever 21, forever on a dark road in New Hampshire, forever on the verge of a life she never got to live. Whether she was a victim of a monstrous crime, a casualty of her own desperate choices, or something else entirely, we may never know. Her story ends where the pavement meets the woods, at the edge of a deep and silent darkness, with a question that has no answer. The mystery of Maura Murray is a modern enigma, a story of a person erased by the wilderness and the digital noise of the internet age. But some stories of erasure are not modern at all. They are ancient, etched into the very foundations of history, stories of power, betrayal, and the murder of children, leaving behind a mystery that has haunted a kingdom for over 500 years. The murder of Gurley Chu Hasenkopf, the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico, at the close of the 20th century, was a place of dramatic, sun-scorched beauty and hidden, transient darkness. It was a city where the ancient cultures of the Southwest met the high-tech world of national laboratories and aerospace engineering. It was a place of vast, open skies and sprawling suburban neighborhoods, a city where a person could feel both profoundly connected to a sense of history and completely, anonymously alone. It was a city of seekers, a magnet for those looking for a new start, for spiritual enlightenment, or simply for a place to disappear. And in 1999, it was the place where a woman named Gurley Chu Hasenkopf, a woman who had traveled halfway across the world in search of a new life, would vanish into the city's unforgiving desert landscape. Gurley Chu, born and raised in Malaysia, was a woman of quiet strength and gentle optimism. She had met an American tourist named Diasian Hasenkopf in her home country in the early 1990s. He was a whirlwind of charisma, a handsome, intelligent man who presented himself as a successful doctor and cancer researcher. To Gurley, he seemed to be the embodiment of the American dream, a ticket to a new and exciting life. They married in 1993, and she moved with him to the United States, eventually settling in Albuquerque. But the dream, as it so often does, quickly soured into a nightmare. The man Gurley had married was not a brilliant doctor, but a masterful con artist. Diasian Hasenkopf, whose real name was Armand Chavez, was a man who had built his entire life on a foundation of elaborate lies. He had no medical degree. He was a grifter who had adopted the persona of a physician to bilk investors and patients out of their money with promises of miracle cures and groundbreaking cancer treatments. His life was a complex web of fraud, false identities, and carefully constructed deceptions. And his marriage to Gurley was just another part of that facade. He was a deeply controlling and abusive husband. He isolated Gurley from her friends, controlled her finances, and subjected her to constant psychological torment. By 1999, Gurley had finally found the courage to leave him. She had filed for divorce and was fighting for her right to a fair settlement. This act of defiance was something Diasian could not tolerate. A divorce threatened to expose his fraudulent life, to unravel the carefully constructed persona of the successful doctor. He became enraged, menacing. Gurley grew increasingly terrified of him. She told her friends and her divorce lawyer that she believed her husband was going to kill her. It was a fear that was tragically, chillingly prophetic. While the divorce proceedings were underway, Diasian had already moved on. He had a new fiancée, a woman named Linda Henning. Henning was a successful fashion designer, a smart and independent woman, but she had fallen completely under Diasian's charismatic spell. He had drawn her into his strange and fantastical world, a world built not just on medical fraud, but on a bizarre and elaborate personal mythology. He told her that he was not just a doctor, but a member of a secret government organization, that he was part of an alien lineage, and that they were on a mission to save the world. He convinced her that he was being hunted by assassins and that Gurley, his estranged wife, was a malevolent reptilian queen from another dimension who was trying to destroy him. It was a world of UFOs, government conspiracies, and intergalactic warfare. A fantasy so compelling and so detailed that Linda came to believe every word of it. She saw Diasian not as a con man, but as a persecuted genius, and she saw herself as his loyal soldier in a cosmic battle. This bizarre and dangerous fantasy would provide the psychological backdrop for the crime that was about to unfold. The stage was set for a tragedy fueled by a potent cocktail of greed, control, and delusional belief. On the morning of Friday, September 10th, 1999, Girlie Chu Hasenkopf failed to show up for her job as a bank teller. This was completely out of character. She was known for her reliability and professionalism. Her concerned colleagues called her apartment, but there was no answer. They then called the police and asked them to perform a welfare check. When officers from the Albuquerque Police Department arrived at Girlie's apartment, they found the door unlocked. The apartment itself was in a state of quiet disarray. A load of laundry was half finished. Girlie's purse, containing her keys and identification, was there. Her car was still in the parking lot, but Girlie herself was gone. The most unsettling discovery was in the bedroom. On the floor, police found several large, bleached-out stains on the carpet, as if someone had hastily and inexpertly tried to clean up a massive spill. The air still held the faint, acrid smell of chlorine. It was a scene that spoke not of a person who had simply left, but of a person who had been violently taken. The police immediately focused their investigation on the one person with a clear motive to harm Girlie, her estranged husband, Diazian Hasenkopf. They knew of the acrimonious divorce, and they quickly learned of Diazian's history of fraud and manipulation. When they brought him in for questioning, he was the picture of calm, cooperative concern. He claimed he had no idea where Girlie was. He had an alibi, of course. He said he had been with his fiancée, Linda Henning, at the time of the disappearance. Linda Henning was questioned next. She too denied any knowledge of Girlie's whereabouts. She corroborated Diazian's alibi, but her demeanor was strange, her story filled with the bizarre, paranoid rhetoric that Diazian had fed her. She spoke of government conspiracies and threats against their lives. To the seasoned detectives, it was clear that something was deeply wrong with her story, but they had no physical evidence to hold either of them. Diazian Hasenkopf and Linda Henning were allowed to walk free. The investigation continued, a frustrating search for a woman who seemed to have vanished into thin air. Police searched the vast, unforgiving expanse of the New Mexico desert, but it was like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of a state. The case was a major local news story, and the community was captivated by the tale of the missing bank teller and her charismatic, fraudulent husband. But for weeks, the investigation yielded nothing. There was no body, no witnesses, and no confession. Girlie Chu was simply gone. But the police were slowly, methodically building their case. They knew that the key to unlocking the mystery lay within the strange, insular world of Diazian Hasenkopf and Linda Henning. They began to dig into their lives, to interview their friends and associates, to try and penetrate the wall of fantasy and lies that surrounded them. And they soon discovered that a secret, however well kept, is a heavy burden to carry alone. Someone in Diazian and Linda's orbit knew what had happened, and it was only a matter of time before that person, crushed by the weight of the truth, would come forward and tell the police a story of abduction, murder, and a bloody night in the desert. A story that would finally reveal the terrible fate of Girlie Chu Hasenkopf. In the weeks following Girlie Chu's disappearance, the Albuquerque Police Department and the FBI found themselves locked in a frustrating battle against a wall of silence and deception. Their prime suspects, Diazian Hasenkopf and his fiancée Linda Henning, maintained their innocence, their stories bolstered by what seemed to be a shared, impenetrable delusion. Investigators were certain they were involved, but the lack of a body was a critical and crippling obstacle. Without a corpse, they had no physical evidence of a murder, and building a no-body homicide case is one of the most difficult challenges in law enforcement. The investigation became a slow, painstaking process of chipping away at the fortress of lies that Diazian had built around himself. Detectives began to unravel his decades-long career as a con artist. They spoke to former patients he had scammed with his fake cancer cures, and to investors he had defrauded. They uncovered a trail of aliases, forged documents, and broken promises that stretched across the country. He was a man who lived his life like a fictional character, and he had successfully drawn Linda Henning into his twisted narrative. The key to breaking the case, investigators knew, would be to find a crack in that shared narrative, a third person who had been privy to their secrets. They began to look closely at the couple's small circle of acquaintances. Their search led them to a woman named Linda, solidifying Diazian as the prime suspect. They now had evidence of motive, opportunity, and a clear attempt to conceal evidence. But the most crucial element was still missing: Gurley's body. Without it, a murder conviction would be incredibly difficult. The vast, unforgiving expanse of the New Mexico desert held its secrets well. But Diazian Hassenkoft, for all his cunning, had made a critical mistake. He had not acted alone. In his arrogance, he had enlisted the help of his best friend, a man named Bill Miller. Miller was a former firefighter and a man with his own troubled past, but he was fiercely loyal to Diazian. As the pressure from the police investigation mounted, that loyalty began to fracture. Miller, terrified of being implicated in a capital murder, made a decision that would blow the case wide open. He walked into a police station and told the investigators everything he knew. His story was a chilling, detailed account of a murder-for-hire plot. Miller confessed that Diazian had approached him with a proposition. He would pay Miller $5,000 to help him get rid of Gurley. Diazian, ever the manipulator, had framed the request in the context of their shared, bizarre mythology. He told Miller that Gurley was not just an inconvenient ex-wife, but an alien queen, a reptilian, who was a threat to their very existence. Killing her was not a crime. It was a necessary act to save the world. Miller, caught up in Diazian's charismatic delusions and tempted by the money, agreed to help. According to Miller's confession, the plan was set for the morning of September 9th, the day before Gurley disappeared. Diazian had instructed his fiancée, Linda Henning, to go to Gurley's apartment. Linda, believing she was on a mission to confront the reptilian queen, did as she was told. She entered the apartment and, using a stun gun, subdued Gurley. Miller then arrived. He claimed that he and Linda bound Gurley with duct tape and forced her into the trunk of a car. They then drove her out into the remote desert landscape west of Albuquerque. It was there, Miller said, that Linda Henning, the woman who had once been a successful fashion designer, committed the final, brutal act. At Diazian's instruction, and fully embracing her role as a soldier in his cosmic war, she had stabbed Gurley Chu to death. After the murder, they returned to the city. Diazian then went to Gurley's apartment with a collection of cleaning supplies and attempted to scrub the scene of any evidence, leaving behind the bleached-out stains on the carpet that the police had discovered. Miller's confession was the bombshell the police had been waiting for. It provided a detailed narrative of the crime. It implicated both Diazian and Linda, and most importantly, it gave the police a potential location for the body. But Miller, in a final, frustrating twist, could not remember the exact location of the grave. He had been to the site only once at night, and the vast, featureless desert landscape offered few landmarks. He could only provide a general area, a wide swath of desolate terrain. Based on his confession, a massive search was launched. Police, FBI agents, and search and rescue teams scoured the desert for weeks. They used cadaver dogs and aerial surveillance, but the sheer size of the search area and the ruggedness of the terrain made the task almost impossible. They never found Gurley's body. Despite the lack of a corpse, the prosecution now had a powerful weapon: the detailed, insider testimony of a co-conspirator. On the strength of Bill Miller's confession, Diazian Hassenkoft and Linda Henning were arrested and charged with the murder of Gurley Chu Hassenkoft. Bill Miller, in exchange for his testimony, was offered a plea deal. The stage was now set for one of the most bizarre and sensational murder trials in New Mexico history, a trial that would feature a tale of con men, alien queens, and a love triangle that had ended in a bloody, secret grave in the desert. The case against Linda Henning was particularly strong. In addition to Miller's testimony, police had found physical evidence that seemed to corroborate her involvement. A search of her home had turned up a ninja sword that she had purchased shortly before the murder. When investigators had first questioned her, they had noticed scratches on her hands and face, consistent with a physical struggle. And in a bizarre twist, a piece of evidence had been found in the pocket of a pair of jeans at Gurley's apartment. A small, folded piece of paper containing Linda Henning's name and phone number. It was as if Gurley, in her final days, had been investigating the new woman in her husband's life. The trial of Linda Henning began, and it was a media circus. The prosecution laid out its case with Bill Miller as their star witness. He recounted the entire story of the abduction and murder in chilling detail. Linda's defense team attacked his credibility, painting him as a liar and a disgruntled friend who was trying to save his own skin by pinning the crime on her. Linda herself took the stand and gave a strange, rambling testimony, filled with the paranoid, sci-fi rhetoric of Diazian's delusional world. She claimed she was the victim of a vast government conspiracy. Her performance did not play well with the jury. She came across not as a victim, but as a deeply deluded and unrepentant participant in a terrible crime. The jury found her guilty of kidnapping and first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 74 years in prison. With Linda Henning convicted, all eyes turned to the man at the center of the web, Diazian Hassenkoft. He was the mastermind, the puppet master who had manipulated everyone around him. But as his own trial approached, the mastercon artist had one last, unexpected trick up his sleeve. The conviction of Linda Henning was a major victory for the prosecution, but she was seen as a pawn in a much larger game. The true target, the man who had orchestrated the entire affair, was Diazian Hassenkoft. His trial was set to be the main event, the final act in a legal drama that had captivated the state. The prosecution was confident. They had the powerful testimony of their star witness, Bill Miller, which had already secured one conviction. They had a mountain of evidence detailing Diazian's fraudulent life, establishing a clear motive of self-preservation. And they had the bizarre, self-incriminating testimony of Linda Henning from her own trial, which painted a vivid picture of the psychological manipulation he had employed. The case against the charismatic conman seemed airtight. But just as his trial was about to begin, Diazian Hassenkoft, the man who had spent his entire life outthinking and outmaneuvering his opponents, made a stunning and completely unexpected move. He fired his defense attorneys and, in a sudden reversal, decided to plead guilty. In January of 2002, he stood before a judge and admitted to his role in the murder of his wife. He confessed to orchestrating the murder-for-hire plot, to soliciting Bill Miller, and to masterminding the entire conspiracy. His confession, however, came with a series of strange and self-serving conditions. As part of his plea deal, he agreed to lead investigators to Gurley's body. But more importantly, he offered a new, revised narrative of the crime, one that was designed to do one specific thing: exonerate Linda Henning. He now claimed that Linda had played no role in the actual murder. He insisted that he alone had killed Gurley, and that his friend, Bill Miller, had been the one who had physically helped him. He claimed that Linda was an innocent, a woman he had manipulated, but who had no blood on her hands. This new confession threw the entire case into a state of confusion. Why would a man who had just pleaded guilty to murder suddenly try to protect his accomplice, the very person whose conviction was based on her role as the killer? To the prosecutors, it was just another one of Diazian's manipulations. They believed he was trying to protect the woman he still loved, or perhaps trying to control the narrative from behind bars, sowing chaos and doubt in a case that had already been decided. They stood by the original testimony of Bill Miller and the conviction of Linda Henning. As part of his plea agreement, Diazian was sentenced to life in prison plus 60 years. The plea deal allowed him to avoid the death penalty, which was likely his primary motivation. With his fate sealed, the final part of the agreement was put into motion: the search for Gurley's body. Diazian provided investigators with a map, a hand-drawn guide to the remote spot in the desert where he claimed to have buried his wife. In September of 2002, a massive search was organized based on this map. A convoy of police vehicles, FBI agents, and forensic teams, with a shackled Diazian Hassenkoft in tow, drove out into the vast, sun-baked landscape of the New Mexico high desert. For days, they searched the area he indicated, a desolate stretch of land near the town of Magdalena. They used ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and heavy excavation equipment. But they found nothing. The desert, once again, refused to give up its dead. Was this another one of Diazian's games? Had he deliberately sent them on a wild goose chase, a final act of defiance against the authorities who had finally caught him? Or was his memory simply faulty, the exact location lost in the featureless expanse of the desert and the fog of his own lies. The search was eventually called off. Girlie Chu Hasenkopf's body has never been found. Her grave remains a secret, known only to her killers and the silent, unforgiving desert. The aftermath of the case is a tangled web of appeals, recantations, and enduring mystery. Linda Henning, from her prison cell, has continued to maintain her innocence, clinging to the narrative that she was a duped and innocent pawn in Diazian's game. She has filed numerous appeals, all of which have been denied. Her story remains a fascinating and tragic case study in the power of psychological manipulation and the depths of human delusion. Was she a cold-blooded killer who actively participated in the murder of a rival? Or was she a victim herself, a woman so thoroughly brainwashed by a charismatic sociopath that she was no longer able to distinguish between fantasy and reality? Bill Miller, the man whose testimony was the key to the entire case, served a reduced sentence for his role in the conspiracy and was eventually released from prison. He has since lived a quiet life, forever marked by his association with the bizarre and brutal crime. And Diazian Hasenkopf, the man at the center of it all, continues to serve his life sentence in a New Mexico prison. He has, at various times, given interviews from behind bars, each one a masterclass in manipulation and self-aggrandizement. He continues to spin his web of lies, sometimes admitting guilt, sometimes hinting at a larger conspiracy, always keeping himself at the center of the story. He has never shown any genuine remorse for the murder of his wife. The case of the murder of Girlie Chu Hasenkopf is more than just a story of a domestic dispute gone wrong. It is a deep dive into the mind of a narcissistic con artist and the bizarre, fantastical world he created. It is a story about the terrifying power of charisma to warp reality, to turn ordinary people into believers, and to convince them that murder is not a crime, but a righteous act in a cosmic war. It is a tragedy that played out at the strange intersection of science fiction fantasy and real-world greed. The lack of a body leaves a permanent, aching void at the heart of the story. Girlie Chu, the woman who had traveled across the world in search of a better life, was ultimately erased, her final resting place a mystery. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often not the ones who look like monsters, but the ones who present themselves as saviors, promising miracle cures and secret knowledge, while hiding a heart of pure, cold darkness. Her name is a testament to the countless victims of charismatic manipulators, the forgotten players in a story where the villain insists on being the star. The legacy of the Girlie Chu Hasenkopf murder is a complex and unsettling one, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and profound psychological wreckage. While the primary players were brought to justice, the case never achieved a sense of true resolution. The failure to recover Girlie's body means that a crucial piece of the narrative will forever be missing, denying her family the closure of a proper burial and leaving a permanent, haunting ambiguity hanging over the case. The desert holds the final truth, and it is a secret it has guarded for over 2 decades. The story remains a powerful and disturbing case study in the psychology of manipulation and folie à deux, a term used to describe a shared psychosis where a dominant person's delusions are transmitted to a more suggestible individual. Diazian Hasenkopf was a classic narcissist and a pathological liar, a man who constructed an elaborate fantasy world not just to defraud others, but to feed his own grandiose sense of self. He was the hero of his own epic, a brilliant scientist and intergalactic warrior battling the forces of darkness. Linda Henning, for reasons that may never be fully understood, became a willing participant in this delusion. She was not just an accomplice. She was a true believer. Her conviction and long prison sentence have been a subject of ongoing debate. Was she a willing and active participant in a brutal murder, fully aware of the consequences of her actions? Or was she, in a very real sense, a secondary victim of Diazian's abuse, a woman whose own identity had been so completely subsumed by his that she was no longer capable of independent moral judgment? The legal system found her culpable, a rational actor responsible for her crimes. But the psychological reality is likely far murkier. Her story is a terrifying exploration of how love and devotion, when twisted by a master manipulator, can become a justification for the most horrific acts. She remains imprisoned, a living testament to the destructive power of a shared delusion. Diazian Hasenkopf, from his prison cell, has continued to be a source of morbid fascination. He represents a unique and particularly modern kind of evil. He was not a monster who lurked in the shadows. He was a monster who thrived in the spotlight, using charisma, intelligence, and a veneer of scientific authority to draw his victims in. He exploited a deep human desire to believe in miracles, in cures for the incurable, and in secret special knowledge. His success as a con man was built on the vulnerabilities and hopes of others. His final act as a murderer was the ultimate expression of his narcissism. When his carefully constructed world was threatened with exposure, he chose to eliminate the source of the threat rather than allow his own fraudulent identity to collapse. He preferred murder to the humiliation of being revealed as an ordinary, pathetic fraud. The case also casts a long shadow over the city of Albuquerque itself, a place that has often been a backdrop for stories of the strange and the unexplained. The elements of the Hasenkopf case, the UFOs, the reptilian queens, the secret government agencies, feel like something ripped from the pages of a pulp science fiction novel, or from the lore of nearby Roswell. But this was not fiction. It was a real-life tragedy where the bizarre, fantastical beliefs of a con man had lethal, real-world consequences. It serves as a stark reminder that the most dangerous cults are often not the large, sprawling organizations, but the cults of two, the intense, isolated relationships where one person's delusion can become another person's reality, with no outside influence to provide a check on the escalating madness. For the family of Girly Chu, particularly her relatives back in Malaysia, the story is one of unimaginable heartbreak. It is the story of a daughter who left home in search of the American dream, only to find a uniquely American nightmare. She was a woman who found the courage to escape an abusive and fraudulent marriage, an act of defiance that ultimately cost her her life. Her story is a powerful testament to the dangers that victims of domestic abuse face, especially when their abuser is a charismatic manipulator with a profound sense of entitlement and a complete lack of empathy. Girly's fear, expressed to her friends and lawyer, that her husband would kill her, was not paranoia. It was a clear-eyed assessment of the man she had married. The mystery of Girly Chu Hasenkopf's final resting place ensures that her story will never fully fade away. As long as her body remains lost, there will always be a sliver of hope, however faint, for a final resolution. It is a story that has become part of the dark folklore of the American Southwest, a tale of a woman who was erased by the vast, silent desert, a victim of a man who believed he was a god, and the woman who helped him commit a murder in the name of a cosmic fantasy. It is a chilling reminder that the greatest threats often come not from monsters, but from men, and the most terrifying lies are the ones we desperately want to believe. The Hasenkopf case was a complex web of lies spun by a single charismatic figure, but sometimes a mystery has no central figure at all. It is a story of a collective vanishing, where multiple people disappear from a single, isolated place, leaving behind only silence and a set of baffling, contradictory clues that have puzzled historians for centuries.